All right, let's get started. So welcome everyone. This is the Drone Responders webinar series, a conversation on public safety UAS with FAA's Michael O'Shea. I call this the Michael O'Shea Show, where he brings in guests from the FAA, and we talk about all the latest issues and answer questions. So we do about 40, 50 minutes of conversation, and then we will take your questions. I would ask everybody to put your questions in the question and answer box, not the chat room. So I'm not looking back and forth between two different places. I want to give you a couple updates. Drone Responders just exceeded 3,900 members this past week. We're seeing 100 new members per week on average and 1,400 visitors to the website per week. So please pass the word out there to others that join Drone Responders, be a part of the network so that we can actually continue sharing all the different things that we're working on. We've got several new working groups. We've got a program manager UAS working group for public safety, and we already have about 100 public safety UAS managers that are signed up. We have women in public safety UAS working group, which is taking off. Our drone as a first responder program now has about, I think about 100 people that are participating and 33 people working on a steering group. So now we're looking at also doing something in relation to beach surf type patrols and creating a working group. So if you're interested in that, send me an email to charles@droneresponders.org. With that, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take over the show and introduce your guest today, and we'll go forward.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mike O'Shea. I'm a program manager in the Office of Unmanned Aircraft Systems Integration at the FAA. I also serve as the public safety liaison for our division. I've been with the FAA now for about 3 years. Prior to that, I spent about 17 years with DOJ. And then prior to that, I spent about 15 years as a uniformed law enforcement officer. As you all know, the testing went live back in April 6th. For the most part, I've heard a lot of positive comments about how the test functioned, worked well. We did have some initial issues with people taking the wrong test. And I think part of that is because, you know, we're in aviation, we're in the aviation business. And so we do things as an aviation business, and we put Part 61, non-Part 61. We should have probably explained to people that manned aviation, so they knew that if you're not in manned aviation taking this test, you should be taking this test. And that test, the one you're supposed to be taking, is ALC-677. So if you've taken another test and you took your 107 through a testing center, then you took the wrong test, and you'll need to retake it. And I've already ran into several people who are very proud of taking the initial test, which is the 451, even though they're not a manned aviation pilot or Part 61 pilot, and then corrected that by taking the ALC 515 test, which is for recurrent for manned aviation pilots. So it's important to remember that Part 61 means that you're a manned aviation pilot and you're taking the 107 test. But if you're not a manned aviation pilot, you need to be taking ALC 677. But other than that, most people, reported back the test seemed to work very well. We had some fears on our end, we'll be perfectly honest, that we thought that the number of people on the system might overwhelm the system. We did hear some people say it went slow a couple times for them, but for the most part, it worked pretty flawlessly. I took 2 tests. I took both the recurrent test for Part 61 pilots, and I took the ALC 677 test for Part 107 pilots. I didn't check them word by word, but they seemed almost like the same test to me. I mean, they were both pretty straightforward. There were a couple of questions. I actually got a question wrong. I have to freely admit that. So nobody's perfect. Yep. The question I got wrong was about the if you're operating at night, do you always have to have your lights on? Can you not have your lights on? And I think one of the other answers was something like, can you dim your lights for safety purposes or something to that extent? And I'm sure I got the wording all wrong, but I just was under the assumption that you couldn't dim your lights anytime. And of course, I didn't read any of the materials that went with the test. I just took the test, and I was wrong. I know I was wrong, because you can dim it for safety purposes, the lights. So I probably gave you an answer there, but and then one question I got right, but it confused me, and that was talking about who was required to have, I think, remote ID, and it said, and it's talking about the categories of aircraft that, how'd they word that, that you fly over people. And it said something like class 1, class 2, and then class 4. And I just got that confused me because 4 is really a different category for ops over people, because it's really talking about, a certified aircraft. But the question really was asking, do all these need to have remote ID? And the answer should have been yes. But for some reason, when they skipped 3, I just assumed that somebody made a mistake, because of course Mike O'Shea would never make a mistake or misunderstand something. But I was wrong. And I did get the question right, but I just thought they worded it wrongly, but it was correct. So other than that, the testing, like I said, was pretty seamless. If you guys had issues with it, let us know. I had an email today from somebody in California that said that they got confused. It's because they were taking the wrong test. So I think we corrected that issue. And I think our Office of Communications did a good job after the fact, sort of, when we realized we were running in this issue, they quickly put out some messaging that said, this is the test you should take. And if you don't remember anything from this today, and talking to John and I, it's 677 is the test you need to take if you are a remote pilot and you're not a manned aviation pilot.
Hey, Mike, I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
So if you take it online, if you fail, what happens?
Can you fail?
Cannot.
You can't.
You take it until you receive a go.
You can give up.
Well, no. So, no. The question is, so if you go through it and you get the questions wrong, is there a number of times that you can do it, or can you keep working through it until you get the answers correct?
I don't know, John. Do you know that answer?
I believe once you start, in order to complete it, you have to eventually get corrected to 100. But you do go back and correct the incorrect answer.
But do we limit how many times they can go back?
No, because you can't. You start all over again. Like if you, but the course, there is a limitation on how many times you can take it and complete it. It's 90 days. That's a system issue. But when you take the course, the knowledge check, you have to eventually get to 100%. So you're really not going to fail it.
Yeah,
somebody said you can take and correct without any limits. That's probably the answer, but I don't know that to be.
I wouldn't sweat it, because 93% pass first time out. So I wouldn't really get too hung up on that.
Yeah, I've got a number of people saying you can correct without a limit. So I just want to put that out there.
Check to make sure, but I'm some of you guys, I'll have to ask, I don't know. I'm sure there's somebody out there who is the same IQ level as me and had to go back and take it multiple times. So if that's the case, if it allowed you to do that, that's great. If not, we'll try to figure out if there is some kind of limitation.
Okay, I do have a question here that says, I took the test ALC 677 for my recurrent test in order to qualify for night and over people. I think that means I'm good for 2 years from that date of the test. If so, I lose a year because I still had a year to go on my previous certificate. Just wondering.
You gained a year. You didn't lose.
You saved $160. Mike, you want to introduce me before we go too far?
We're not there yet. We're almost there yet.
We're almost there.
So we're getting there. But some of the other things I want to talk about is also, when you guys are thinking about these sessions we're doing, let us know if there's things that you specifically want to hear, resources that you guys need, because we're always trying to create product and everything from guides to whatever that will support your public safety mission. Just let us know, because we're trying to figure out, as we work through our next, get ready for our next fiscal year, which starts October 1, what things we should be working on. Also, I wanted to point out before I get to John, and John, you're after this, is that we sort of have a companion webinar to this that the FAA does. It's called Droning On for Public Safety. And we stole the day and the times, but just switched the Wednesday to the 4th Wednesday of the month. We do a webinar online. If you want information about that, it's just an informal chat. And the way we do that, instead of interviewing, like here, we interview somebody from the FAA. On that one, we actually highlight a program, a public safety program out in the field. Like the first one we did, Chula Vista Police Department, The second one we did Austin Fire Department and Travis County EMS. And this one that's coming up, we're going to be doing the Wilmington, Delaware Police Department and Fire Department. We're going to highlight their programs, let them talk about what they're doing. I think it's really kind of important. I think it gives you kind of, I don't want to call it yin and yang, but it gives you the opportunity to talk to the FAA in this webinar, and in the next webinar allows you to talk to your peers about what they're doing in their program. So if you need information on that, we'll be happy to connect you with that. And now let me introduce my guest. My guest, my guest is John Meehan. John Meehan is with Flight Standards. John, if you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll add some tidbits that I know about you afterwards. Or if you lie, I'll correct those lies. And
Let's see, I can talk for 57 minutes and then you won't have that chance, but
go ahead.
Hello, everybody. As Mike said, my name is John Meehan. I've also been with the FAA, I think coming up on 4 years. My background is pretty diverse. I've done a lot of different things. Was an Army helicopter pilot for a number of years, an instructor pilot in the Army, and then I've been out in private industry selling airplanes and selling coal and chartering ocean-going ships for a while and living in Amsterdam, which was pretty wild. And a great experience. But I've been in Flight Standards for about almost 3 years now, and a big part of my job is outreach, and I do a lot of work with our Flight Standards district offices, our FAA safety team, and helping them spread the gospel about aviation culture and trying to help everybody who will listen to us that from our perspective, you are an aviator flying a real aircraft and operating in the National Airspace System. And if you have a department, you are in a flight department, which is a cultural kind of a shock for some. But and I just, while I have the mic, I want to also say this. So it's not really a test. It's training. So, get the test thing out of your head for it's recurrent training, and that's why you correct it to 100%. And interestingly enough, I also have some statistics. We are seeing about 750 people taking the training a day now, and
Wow.
So which is great. And if you look at when people had to go back and take the recurrent test at the Knowledge Testing Center, which was prior to April 6th, since that's been in operation, we only had about 29,000 remote pilots do that. And here we are, what are we, a week into it, and we've got over 5,000 already done. So that just shows you, I think, that the industry is voting with their feet, and I did see a question in the Q&A box, by the way. You do have to create an account on FAAsafety.gov in order to take those training courses that Mike was talking about. And one more thing, and then I'll throw it back to you, Mike and Charles. I have on with me in the background, I do have some colleagues who can answer questions for you. I have Steve Pansky, who is he's part of our team, and Steve is our airspace expert, and you can take what Steve tells you to the bank. And he is also our CAPS subject matter expert and public declaration letter expert. And then I also have some colleagues from Flight Standards who work on waivers. And Skip Wiegand is on with me, and also Mike Wilson should be joining us if he's not already here as well.
He's already here. He's already said that the test is correctable to 100%. He already answered.
All right, great. Yeah. So and those guys, I work with them. I talk with them every single day. And so back to you, Mike and Charles.
So it is interesting, and we were telling people that it is training. It's not a test, but when you do it, it says now take the exam. I was kind of like,
Yeah.
If we're going to tell them it's training, why don't we call it an exam? Why don't we call it
there's
a knowledge
whole
check? Or something?
We have a whole course on how to come up with clever synonyms.
Yeah, but I was kind of like, it was different. So just kind of tell you a little bit more about John that you may not know. John is a West Point grad, and wasn't your dad a West Point grad?
Yes.
and his oldest son is a West Point grad.
That's
But
right.
which makes this all interesting is his youngest son is currently in the Naval Academy. So it's probably very interesting over the holidays when they sit down and talk about, their respective, I'll get out of it, but respective places of learning. But
Yeah, he crossed over to the dark. He crossed
son.
over to the dark side of the force. But I gotta tell you, I'm very proud of my prodigal son. He's a lacrosse player on the Naval Academy lacrosse team, and he's a defensive midfielder. He's number 10. And if you watch ESPN Plus, you will see him playing. He's finally getting some good playing time, and their game this weekend is against Loyola, and should be a tough game. But then the Army-Navy game is the 24th of April, and I'm
surprised you'd have it playing in the background behind.
I'm probably going to have to leave the country when that happens.
But no, I just wanted to point that out. I think that's really says a lot. That is the dedication for public service that his kids have done, and you've done, and your father did. So that's really cool. So
one other thing though is I got to say that on my team I have two Naval Academy, well, Canoe U we call them, but two Naval Academy graduates, Skip Wiegand and Mike Wilson, are both Navy grads, and people think people for some reason can't understand there's a little bit of a rivalry between Army and Navy, particularly, once or twice a year. Don't understand that. Anyway, we digress.
I knew this was a bad idea having John on this webinar.
So if you want to talk about lacrosse, I will talk about lacrosse all day long. Yeah.
So today we're gonna talk a little bit with John about some of the nuances with the new rules that came out. Some things that you should probably know that we really haven't discussed. I mean, we talked about taking the test. We talked about remote ID. And we talked about some of the nuances, the categories of observed people and stuff. But there's information you need to know that exists in those rules that is going to impact you. So the first question I have for you, John, is after the 21st of April, if I'm a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, and I run into somebody who's operating a UAS, what are they required to show me?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did an amendment to Part 107, and as you said, those rules for that particular situation become effective on the 21st of April. So as of the 21st of April, anyone flying under Part 107 is required to show local law enforcement, the TSA, the NTSB, and the FAA their photo ID, and the photo ID does not need to be a government ID. It just has to have your photo, your signature, your I'm drawing a blank here, Mike. What's the other part? Your photo, your full name. Yeah, your full name and your signature. And it cannot be electronic, by the way. So that's and that's in the preamble if you want to understand more of that. But the main reason why the FAA chose not to make it electronic versions acceptable was because there's different formats and there's not consistency between those formats. So, and interestingly enough, a lot of people think they're flying as a rec flyer, but maybe they're not complying with the recreational flyer exception 44809, and that bumps them back into Part 107. So that's what they're required to show law enforcement upon request. And then I think it's probably a good idea to point out what they're not required. And they are required to show their drone registration. So it's photo ID, the drone registration, and the remote pilot certificate, the plastic remote pilot certificate. Let me see if I can find mine real quick.
And somebody asked about that too, and they said, "Are you going to get a new one?" Well, the old one doesn't have an expiration date. You just have to do your recurrent training to be recurrent.
That's right. Yeah. So people think, "Hey, my remote pilot certificate expired." No, they don't expire. Here's mine. I'll show it to you. So this is what it looks like. And there's Mike showing his. So they do not have an expiration date on them. So they are good until either the FAA revokes it, which has happened, or a person asked to have it canceled, I believe is the term. But what does expire is every 24 months after you take the initial test, then every 24 months you have to renew your recency of knowledge. And this is what Mike was talking about earlier about after the 6th of April, then that was one of the big rule changes, which was you no longer, if you already had your Part 107 certificate, then you no longer had to go back to the Knowledge Testing Center, pay the $160. You can now go do this online for free on FAAsafety.gov. So that's huge. And I also took that training and 677, and it is excellent. And I took 677 because I am a Part 61 certificated pilot. I have a commercial helicopter and private fixed wing, but I did not have a current flight review. So that also put me into the 677 course. So the only people who can take 451 and 515 are Part 61 pilots with a current flight review. And I had a question yesterday. Somebody called me up, someone we all know, who shall remain nameless, asked me and said, hey, my flight review expires in 2 weeks. Can I take 515? Right? I said, yes, because the day you take your remote pilot recurrency training, that's when that recency of your flight review matters. If you lose your medical on your Part 61, that's okay, because medical is not required. A medical certificate is not required for Part 107. So, so some people think, hey, does the Part 107, if you do that with the recency of knowledge under Part 61 with a current flight review, does it have to match your validity of your current flight review? And the answer is no. Just when you take that course, you have to be within the last 24 months of your Part 61 flight review. So, but for the vast majority of you, 677 is the course you're looking for.
So John, I think it's important to let people know that the initial testing under Part 107 still has to happen at a testing site. But now that we sort of introduced people to FAAsafety.gov, besides taking, your recurrent test, what else is there for people?
Hey, before you do that, I want to ask the question to Mike. You said you got to go to the testing site, and I've had a question in my text saying, why? Why can't the original training be online and not have to do that?
I think mainly because of quality control, because people can cheat. And the way we do all of our pilot certificates is you have to go to a knowledge testing center. And the only
go. Now we have an answer. Thank you.
Yep. And the only people who don't have to do that are military pilots who have had that, and then they go to the FSDO. But everybody, even private pilots, all those guys have to go to the knowledge testing center. And by the way, this is what you want to print off when you know you've done it. And you may have to log off. I had an issue where I completed the course and it said print it off. Oh, and I couldn't find it. I had to log off FAAsafety.gov and then log back on, and then I was able to save it and print it. And it also gives you, by the way, it gives you a mini version, which I'm going to go get laminated. And because you have to carry, you have to show that to the FAA. If the FAA asks for that, you have to be able to produce it. You have to have it on you when you're flying.
And you also saw some other comments there that they do the in-person testing to verify identity. And it's also part of the DHS background check they do or TSA background they do on all new pilots.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough on that, a lot of people don't know that when you apply for your Part 107 certificate, there is a DHS, what do they call it? A threat safety assessment, something like that. I think that's what they call it. And that's why there's a delay because TSA does that check on every pilot applicant, whether it be for Part 107, Part 61 private pilot. They all have to get vetted first, and then for for some foreign pilots, sometimes it becomes a problem because the FAA cannot issue your permanent card until you pass that security threat assessment. That's what it's called. So,
And this is why we have this webinar, to have these live questions, to be able to hear it from the professionals as to why. So now you know why.
yeah, it's I spend a lot of my time reading. I had a question yesterday. Here's a good one. If you use a tether, does the tether weight count towards the weight of the drone? I really got that question yesterday, and I found the answer. And the answer is in the final rule of Part 48 in the preamble. And lo and behold, the weight of that portion of the tether that is lifted up by the drone, that portion of the tether does count towards the total weight. So
unless you're flying under 346 and you have an aircraft that weighs less than 4.4 pounds, then the tether weight doesn't count.
Yeah.
So it's making things be more confusing, but
yeah.
So back to my original question before Charles, no, I'm just kidding, Charles.
That's what I do.
Is, so we've got people that we've sort of introduced them to FAAsafety.gov. What else is there for them on that site?
Oh, yeah, right. Thanks. Yeah, so there's a lot of great information about weather. There's a lot of, one of the courses that stands out in my mind that I did years ago, which was about thunderstorms, and speaking of weather, we just had in our own internal, webinar, we had some folks come on and talk about how drones are really affected by rain and by, because of the blades spinning, they're more prone to icing and thunderstorms. We train manned pilots to stay at least 20 nautical miles away from a thunderstorm. And it's because of that potential for lightning. And, drones are very affected. Remember, you're also flying on unlicensed spectrum, which is home Wi-Fi. So when it's lightning and thundering out there, you're going to be affected by it. And rain does some bad things to those motors sometimes. So something to think about. By the way, Robert had asked a question about proof of currency or recency of knowledge. You do have to show that to the FAA upon request. And typically an electronic version of that would be fine to show the inspector if they showed up.
So John, when the new amendments to Part 107 become effective on April 21st, does this mean that pilots can fly, Part 107 pilots can fly at night without a waiver?
Yeah, great question. I had a conversation yesterday with a fire department up north of here, and that the person he had taken his initial test 6 months ago, and said, hey, after the 21st of April, can I fly at night without a waiver? And I said, not until you've taken that new training, because if you look at the amendment, there's a few big things that happened when we amended Part 107. We created a whole new subpart called Subpart D, which relates to operations over people and moving vehicles, and we'll probably talk more about that later. But there was another big one for this community here, which was we amended Part 107.29, which is restricts you to daylight, and it's going to allow for night flight under really two big conditions. One is that you've taken the most recent training. So anybody who wants to fly at night without a waiver to 107.29 after the 21st of April, when that becomes effective, needs to go take that ALC 677 or take the initial test at the Knowledge Testing Center. And that's been changed, by the way, also. That make sense there? And speaking of night waivers, right, that leads right into the other one. Hey, I've got a night waiver, right? What's going to happen with that? And if you have a night waiver right now, it's going to be valid until the 17th of May. They're all going to terminate. Now, can somebody technically apply for a waiver tonight after that to, I never talked about the second condition, darn it. So there's a second condition. Not only do you have to take the updated training, but you also have to have your drone equipped with lights that are visible for 3 statute miles and flash at a rate that prevents a collision with a manned aircraft. And speaking of the 3 statute miles, might as well cover that one, right? The 3 statute miles is not so you can send it out 3 statute miles. The 3 statute miles is there so manned aviation can see the drone far enough away to maneuver. That's why it's there. You're still got the night. You still have visual line of sight requirements when you're flying at night. And I use the acronym LAST DON, but your visual acuity is much lower at night simply because your rods and your cones, and you'll learn this by taking that training course, by the way, that's in there. It's also in the pilot handbook in chapter 17. Anybody who thinks that this now allows them to go take their drone at night, fly it out 3 statute miles, you are wrong, Charlie. No, sir.
There's that no.
That's the big no. Yeah, that's why Mike O'Shea calls me Dr. No. Hey, I'm just trying to help you, because if you do that and you hit the bus driven by the nun full of orphans and the FAA comes and investigates, it's going to be an unhappy ending.
For you.
So John, I've been looking at some of the public safety forums, and people are very excited on April 21st. They're going to get to fly over people because the new rule allows that. And of course, I'm just going, can you explain why you are Dr. No on this?
Yeah, wow. So, and admittedly, this is not easy to understand. It does not allow for willy-nilly flights over people. It creates 4 categories of operations over people. And first, let me say the bottom line is don't fly over people. If you want to fly over people, then you have to comply with subpart D, which has a lot of requirements. One is you have to have a drone that is approved by the FAA for that category of operation. And there are 4 categories of operations over people: category 1, 2, 3, and 4. Category 4 is a type certificated drone. There are 0 out there right now. There are about 2 dozen in the works, I think, but 0 out there right now. So that won't be one. Category 3 is for a drone that can hit somebody with a force of 25 foot-pounds or more. There are 0 category 3 approved drones right now. There are some obviously going to do that. Then that particular category of drone may only be flown in a closed set over people who know it's there and are good with that. So think about a movie set or maybe even a fire scene where their access is closed off and denied. That's a category 3 operation over people. And then there's a category 2, which is 11 foot-pounds. That also has to be, and there are 0 category 2 drones approved right now. And then so we're down to category 1, and a category 1 drone is a drone that is 0.55 pounds or less and has prop guards. And there's 0 drones that, now those don't need approval, but I am aware of 0 because even the Mavic Mini, when you put the prop guards on, pushes it above 0.55 pounds. So, and then we can talk about what public safety really wants to do, I think, a lot, which is what we call sustained operations over open assemblies of people, as opposed to what I was talking about before was basically transient kind of operation. And to do that, you need to have remote identification installed and functioning on your drone as well. So while it's, I mean, it sounds great, and these drones, these new categories of drones are going to have to be, people are, and it's going to be, I think it's going to be done mostly by manufacturers because they're going to have to submit testing data. The FAA is going to have to approve their declaration of compliance, so they're going to review them. And then the drone will have to be marked as, okay, this is a category 2 drone. So for you who also do a lot of work at public aircraft, you've heard the term self-certify. You're not going to be able to do that with these category drones. We're not going to say, you know, hey, Sheriff Billy Bob's a good guy, so I'm just going to let him do it. No, it's going to have to be some serious testing and proof. And what I've been told also that we'll start accepting submissions for those on the 21st of April. I don't know the website yet, but that's the plan for that right now. And long-winded answer. So bottom line is, no, you still can't. It's a teaser, you know, and technology will catch up. And when you have, now you can still apply for a waiver to 10739, right? And some of you have that out there, but that would be the way to do that. So taking the new course, by the way, if you take the new course, the only thing that new course would enable you to do would be fly at night. Taking the new course doesn't give you approval to fly over people. So you could, and so what does that mean? You say, well, if you were within your recency, you were within your 24 months today, and the 21st of April comes by, so I'm still good, right? I can't fly at night unless I go back and take the new course. But the rule change for over people, taking that new course isn't going to do anything for you there. All that's going to do is change the rules. So long-winded answer, but it's a complicated topic, but hopefully everybody's taken away like, hey, you know, it doesn't give you a blanket approval to go fly over people. You still got to think, no, can't do that.
But to the positive side, it does kind of set the stage for manufacturers to know what to do to make that technology catch up, as you were talking about.
Absolutely. And we all, I think, can pretty much assume that there are manufacturers who are going to meet that demand pretty quick, right? And those that do are going to do well, because everybody want those machines, I think. And as I think about what would I do if I were in your shoes, I'd be starting to budget for new equipment within the next 3 years, because remote ID is going to be mandatory even for you in 3 years. And remote ID, I think, and remote ID coupled with operations over people categories and the requirement for a category approved drone, I think is going to make the new drones are going to be different than what's out there today. That's just my personal opinion. I have no insight on that, though.
And to keep us on track, I just want to let people know, we see your questions. We'll answer the questions at the end, but just so we can keep on track, we'll keep on with the program, and then we'll do the questions. And
hopefully, Charles, are Skip and Mike also able to see and answer those Q&As as well, do you think?
Yeah, they're doing some, but we'll go over them on, an open session so everybody can hear them.
Okay.
Yeah, and a couple of things to remember is if you have a drone right now that's actively supported by a company, it's not like my DJI Spark that's no longer made by DJI. If I was you, I would contact your manufacturer to see if they're going to download software that makes your drone compliant with the remote ID. Because if they tell you no, then John's absolutely right. You're going to have to be shopping. And you can buy what's called a broadcast module to attach, but it's going to limit your operations, and it's probably not what you want. Because
standard, you have to have standard to go beyond visual line of sight, which is the whole.
Right. So you'll be limited to, visual line of sight 400 feet with a broadcast module. The other thing that's important to remember is I've already had people call me and say, hey, Mike, I've got a DJI Mavic Mini and I can stick my finger in the prop and it doesn't hurt when it hits. So then I should be able to operate that. And the way you really need to look at that is if it's sitting on your desk or in your hand and you run it and the prop is at idle and you stick your finger in there, yeah, you may get cut and it may not be very serious. But what I try to tell people is I have a 1.5-year-old grandson who likes to run around in just his diapers. If you fly your drone at 35 miles per hour, which is how fast these things can go, and you run it into his little soft belly, what do you think is going to happen? And that's why you really need to think that way. Don't think, well, I can stick my finger in there. I'm a he-man or he-woman, and it doesn't bother me. But it's not you we're worried about. It's the general public that you're flying around. So that's when you need to consider that. And
remember, the formula is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So it's not just the prop, right? It's the energy that. So to Mike's point, and if you're thinking that way, gentlemen and ladies, you need an attitude adjustment for aviation safety. Seriously, because aviation safety culture doesn't think that way. Just saying.
Next question. On a happier
Doctor, no.
really, but how do these new rules impact me if I'm operating under a public aircraft COA?
Yeah, it's a great question. So public aircraft COAs are flown under Part 91. And these amendments were only to Part 107. But the standard certificates of waiver / authorization, they're called a COA. And they typically do include a provision to allow you to fly at night. You have to do some training and you have to equip your drone, and there's other requirements. They might be slightly different than what the new amendment says for Part 107. And the COAs do allow for operations over people in life safety situations momentarily. And again, this is a difference also that, and this is why I keep coming back to, if you want to do sustained operations over people, that's an SGI. You got to call the Systems Operations Support Center, whether you're operating under your Part 91 COA, because remember, your COAs only give you momentary for life safety emergencies. And once you've dropped that buoy or whatever, phone, whatever, right, then you need to move out of the way. And a lot of departments want to be operating in a sustained manner. And that is not in your COA. That's an SGI phone call away, however, yeah.
So John, I have a COA and it allows me to operate at night as long as I have night training. So I'm also Part 107 pilot. So I took the new FAA recurrent training and got trained on night operations. Can I use that training to satisfy my public aircraft COA night training?
Ooh, what a great question. The answer is they are mutually exclusive because you're operating under Part 91 with your COA. So and this is actually raises another good point that we always try to make, is before takeoff, the crew needs to understand we're flying under Part 91 for this mission. Got that? Yeah, 91 COA. And then mission's over, say, okay, now we're flying under Part 107, right? And why do we do that? Because the rules are a little bit different. And this is another reason why, if you're going to do public aircraft operations and you're going to do 107 operations, you're adding a level of complexity into your learning as well. Now, there's some overlap in the training concepts. Yeah, probably. But if you have a COA and you want to fly at night, you got to comply with what that COA says for your training and equipage. Because when, God forbid, you hit the bus driven by the nun full of orphans and the FAA inspector comes up to see what's going on, he's going to say, let me see your COA. And say, let's see, it says here that you had training in this, did you? Yes. Okay, let me see your training records to prove that. Okay. And then now, no, I was flying under 107. Okay, 107. So 107 to fly at night, your drone has to be equipped with 3 lights that are 3 statute miles. You got that? Yep. I see that. Now let me see your recency of knowledge that you took the 677. Let me see proof of that. So, okay, there it is. Okay. But is there overlap? Are the concepts the same? Generally speaking, yes. The night visual illusions are the same, whether you're flying as a public aircraft or as a civil aircraft. Your fovea centralis is the same for whether you're flying as public safety or public aircraft or as a civil aircraft. So a lot of the same. Long answer.
There's a long answer, but I'm not sure you answered it. But I think what I got out of your answer was that, there are specific requirements for night operations under your COA. If you think the training under 107 satisfies that, it does. Or if you don't think it does, it doesn't. I mean, you're required to tell the FAA that you've had the appropriate training to operate at night. And this is an FAA training for night operations. So I'll let you make the connection and whether or not you think that satisfies the COA.
Yeah, and guess what, folks? Our legal people are telling us that training is not a public aircraft function. So guess what? If you're doing night training, you're governed by Part 107. So let me see your certificate. So it's never easy.
Yeah. And just so you know, and I think we've discussed this before in some past webinars, is under public aircraft operations, under public aircraft law, it actually says that big G, which means federal government in congressional language, can train with under public aircraft, but it doesn't say little g, which means state, local, tribal, territory governments can train. And so the legal interpretation is basically if it's not prescribed, it must be proscribed. And so we're working on that issue now because we know it's an issue.
Yeah.
And we're trying to get it resolved. But currently, the consideration of the interpretation by our general counsel is that you cannot train as a public aircraft operator under PAO if you're a state, local, tribal, territory agency. So back to remote ID.
Which is another reason why to get everybody certificated under 7. Yeah, I know. We had a situation in the South where a department had almost hundreds of violations. So it could have been a happy thing. And I, as I understand it, they immediately terminated the program when the FAA report was given, and they immediately moved them under their manned aviation wing because they were so shocked at how exposed they were to unhappy endings.
It's a very nice way of saying what happened there, but
Yeah.
so back to kind of the new rules. Do public safety have to comply with remote ID? And when do we have to comply with remote ID?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, the short answer is yes. Everybody who has to register a drone has to comply with with remote ID, which is now called Part 89, by the way. Now the U.S. military does not have to register because they have their own system. So they are exempt. There are certain educational and research institutions that may apply to obtain an exemption. Public safety could ask for an exemption. I think we're still working on what that process might be, Mike, I think, right? And how to go about doing that. But the general, think about it like this, right? What's the purpose of remote ID? And there's 2 purposes, really. One is to distinguish between somebody who's being naughty and somebody who's being nice, somebody who's supposed to be there, somebody who's not supposed to be there. Because I know from your point of view in public safety, you guys get irritated all the time with people flying around your operations, right? So this is going to allow you to know that's Billy Bob Meehan over there, and I can track him, I can see him. But the other, and in my opinion, the more important reason why we're moving to RID is an incremental step towards giving you the holy grail, I call it, of beyond visual line of sight and operating over people long distances, which then makes drones economically viable. It does a whole lot of things. But in order to do that, you need something that's going to allow the airspace to be coordinated. And those drones need to transmit something so that you can pick it up. Because, current radar systems, most airport radar systems, well, many cannot pick up a drone. Yeah. And, think about it. I know there's ADSB. We haven't really talked about ADSB. May as well talk about that now, right, Mike? So Part 89 on the 21st of April, when it becomes effective, says ADSB out for drones is prohibited. So unless you get an exception by the administrator. So, and there are people who have gotten, I know the Department of Interior has gotten them. Now, ADSB out, I'm sure, will be required for above 400 feet, the ones going way high up there. But that's a case-by-case basis. But in general, especially if you're operating up to 400 feet, after the 21st of April, you better disconnect that if you don't have a written approval from the FAA, because then you'd be in violation of Part 89. I'm just full of news, aren't I?
And just so you know, in the discussions we're having about when you could turn on or off remote ID or strangle the squawk of remote ID, the pretty much the feeling of the working group is that it'll be very, 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 very rare we would allow that type of operation. And the only one that we could sort of come up with in talking with some of our national security partners would be Border Patrol operating in very rural areas where if they were doing remote ID, the bad guys would know it's them. And for public safety, as a general rule, we have some concerns that as we move towards the future, we're going to start having counter UAS systems that are out there protecting critical infrastructure, and their first target is going to be drones that are not broadcast. And so you don't want your very expensive drone to be taken down. And then for public safety who say, well, I don't want the Acme Police Department's drone, everybody's going to start knowing that, that drone number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the Acme Police Department. And we don't want them to know that. So one of the things the FAA is actually working on right now is a thing called Session ID, which will give the ability to basically randomly generate a number for that operation that still comes back to us that says, now the new number, whatever it is, 7543221, we still can interpret that to be the Acme Police Department. So that's hopefully it's going to be, available sometime, in the not too distant future. But
yeah, and we can't have it both ways, folks, right? If we want to go long distances beyond visual line of sight, got to have a way to know where that thing is, right? So
Hey, Mike, I just wanted to set a stage, 6 minutes, and then we'll try to go into these questions.
Okay, a couple other questions, and then we'll kind of finish it out here. But one of the questions we're getting a lot, John, is will the public be able to see where my drone's at?
Remote ID, right? Yeah, the answer is the information that is broadcast by the remote ID system is either standard or broadcast module. That message will be publicly available to anyone who's got a receiver within range of that. Now, and this is why Mike was talking about changing, giving public safety in particular the ability to not transmit the serial number of the remote ID to the in the clear, because people could figure out a pattern after a while, but so could the good guys figure out a pattern of the bad guys that way. But the session ID would then mask the serial number and then still allow the FAA to know who was there, et cetera.
Can you also see where the person operating the drone is at?
Yeah, good one. So the difference between standard and broadcast is under standard remote identification, the location of the ground control station is transmitted in the message packet. And with broadcast module, and that's the broadcast module is something you could bolt on to the drone, and that transmits the takeoff location of where the drone took off. That's the only difference there between the two. And if you want to go beyond visual line of sight, you must have a drone equipped with standard remote identification.
And I know I've heard some concerns from public safety agencies saying, and also from private citizens saying, hey, the people that would have, their smartphone and they can look at my drone and say, hey, that's serial number ABC123. And oh, by the way, the operator's over there at 5th and Main. They're like, that really, interferes with my privacy. And I've tried to tell people that, 99% of all operations are visual line of sight operations. And I don't need this to see where you're at. I just look up and see a drone and I should be able to look around and see the operator. It should be that easy. So, and of course we know people are operating illegally beyond visual line of sight. As I walked my dog yesterday around my neighborhood, a drone went overhead, saw no operator anywhere. So
the party's coming to an end for those folks.
Yep. And I think that's a good thing. So let's go ahead and thanks, John, for the answers to those questions. Those are all good answers. And hopefully everybody knows that if you have questions, our really job is to be a resource for public safety. And John's a great resource for that. So is Mike Wilson, so is Skip, so is Steve Pansky. Everybody works really hard to try to help you guys do your job. But let's go. And so if you have additional questions, that you think about later, feel free to email us or reach out to us and we're happy to assist and to help. Yep. So Charles, we'll turn it back over to you to start asking some questions.
Here we go. So reference to the recurrency test, which comes in effect April 21st, correct?
Training.
Question, training. Yes, training. Sorry. Do I take this training now or later is the question.
Take it now.
And it will become effective on the 21st though, correct?
No.
No, the
the-
recurrency
the-
becomes effective immediately,
Okay,
Yeah,
but the ability to operate at night doesn't take effect until the 21st.
okay, good point.
yeah, but take it now, yeah, I would take it as soon as you can.
Okay, is this a correct statement? 107 allows operation beyond visual line of sight, BVLOS, of the remote pilot in command without a waiver, provided that the aircraft is within visual line of sight of the observer and communication is maintained.
No.
Negativo. That is a incorrect.
So if you look at the rule under 107, it says that the aircraft must be visible, visually visible to both the pilot and the observer,
Yeah, so when and
not one or the other.
you have to read the rule really carefully, because it says must be able to, and then the other person is exercising. Okay, that's what must be able to means is that if Mike O'Shea is my visual observer and he's watching the drone and I'm the remote pilot and I'm looking down, I must be able to look up and see that drone well enough to meet that John Meehan's last Don criteria: location, altitude, speed, direction of flight, obstacles. So at all times. And then people also say, well, what about daisy chaining? Well, daisy chaining could be done by daisy chaining remote pilots, but not visual observers. And that is covered in the preamble to 107 there. But yeah, very much misunderstood there. But you have to be able, even if you're not looking at it. That's why we don't approve people sitting in a Connex controlling the drone, because you can't look up and see the drone and the surrounding area.
It is a little different under a public aircraft COA. It will allow the observer to be in the Connex and not the observer, but the remote pilot in command to be in the now you got me, to be remote in the Connex container. I can't speak today. As long as the visual observer has a view of the aircraft and they're in good positive communications, unless the COA doesn't prohibit it or allow it. But yeah, so the answer is no. The pilot also always has to have the ability to visually observe the aircraft. And so somebody was talking to me about, but I can have visual observers out and I can do a extended visual line of sight.
A daisy chain for 10 miles.
Term, and we've heard it used a lot, but it's not anything under 107.
Yeah.
Okay, often working in the fire department, we do not carry wallets in the middle of the night because we're wearing turnout clothing. We have our FAA certificates online. Can we present digital copies of these documents, or must we carry the hard cards and paper?
Electronic versions, copies of your photo ID and your pilot certificate are not approved. So you must have them with you and readily available when you fly. So you might need to change your way you operate for that. Now, is the reality that the inspector is going to go up in the middle of a fire and say, stop, you're flying correctly, but I want to see your documents? Come on. I don't think he's going to do that. Now, if he sees something gross, flagrantly wrong, then they might have a different way. But no, the photo ID, the UAS registration, and the remote pilot certificate, hard copies on your person, readily accessible.
Okay, for agencies that are flying under COAs, tactical beyond visual line of sight waivers especially, that also have night waivers, does the sunsetting night waivers affect agency pilots in any way?
Now, we already talked about this, that
Mutually exclusive.
there are two different ways to operate.
Yeah,
did I understand correctly that there are
COA, you're
webinars?
under part 91, 107 is 107. The two shall not mix in flight.
The only part of the new rules that really impact public aircraft operation is the remote ID. The actual, having either a standard remote ID or the broadcast module.
Did I understand correctly that there are webinars that spotlight public safety agencies like Austin Fire Department? And you mentioned that the fourth Wednesday of each month at 4 p.m.?
Yep, it's called Droning On for Public Safety. And I don't know if Alina's online with us today, but she can give you the information about where it's at. If not, you can just email me and I'll connect you with Alina, who actually runs it. And I just talk. She does all the real work. So.
Okay, isn't Tethered exempt from Part 107?
So you need to be very careful here, because when we're talking about tether, that would be, and it's nothing's really exempt from 107. So, but there's certain requirements you don't have to meet as long as you're a public aircraft, you're a public agency, and you're operating under what we call Section 346 of the 2018 Reauthorization Act, that talks about publicly active tethered UAS. And it basically says if you're operating a UAS that's 4.4 pounds or less, that has a tether that is strong enough to prevent that aircraft from flying away, and that it can only go up 150 feet, then there are certain things you don't have to meet. You don't have to have a Part 107 license. You don't have to register that aircraft. However, you still have to meet a lot of the other rules and regulations, which is why it's probably still worth knowing all the rules and regulations and taking the 107 before operating even a tethered aircraft, because you have to yield right away, which is the big thing. We heard a lot of people saying, hey, I was going to get this tethered aircraft, we're going to mount it to our fire truck, we're going to launch it to 150 feet, and we can just walk away and forget it. And it's like, no, that's not true. That's not what we're telling you. We're telling you that because it's sort of a controlled small operation, we're going to allow greater public safety use of this, but there's still hoops you have to jump through, or regulations you have to follow. And with the biggest one being the ability to get that aircraft out of the way of manned aviation aircraft.
Yeah, and just, I guess, two other comments. One is that you can never be a threat to the NAS, no matter what rules you operate under. So that's kind of the, right? So, and you always have to give way to manned traffic. But to come back specifically, does a tether, if the flight is governed by Part 107, does putting a tether on it make it not applicable? The answer is no. The tether does nothing. It can be a safety mitigation when you're applying for a waiver to a regulation, but the tether does not nullify a regulation under Part 107.
Yeah, so if you have a 4.5 pound aircraft and you put a tether on it, it's still a 107 operation.
Yeah, and you know what? I got believe it or not, I got a email about this also from a fire department that worked for an oil company, and said, hey, we just bought this new truck with this drone thing, that we don't, and our chief says we don't need to register, we don't need no badges, we don't need nothing. And he goes, oh, yes, you do, because you're not eligible for public aircraft. You're not a political subdivision of the state. So guess what? That doesn't apply to them. And so be careful what these folks are marketing products to you, when you, because the FAA, it's about the safety of the national airspace system, and some of the promises made by some of the marketers, cannot be met by the remote pilot.
So you're saying that in order to fly the tethered drone, you have to be eligible to be public aircraft operations. Does that mean you have to have a COA, or does it just mean you have to be eligible to be a public aircraft operation?
Well, we don't have a lot of case law on this, but the law, the section in the law that was written that way, it says it's a public aircraft that's actively tethered. So first you got to be public aircraft, and to meet the definition of a public aircraft, 49 U.S.C. 401A 41, right? And that's where that big G, little g comes in. If you don't meet that definition, that section doesn't apply to you at all. Sorry, it doesn't work. So, and I think a lot of people are being set up to get in trouble because they're not eligible for that. Volunteer fire department couldn't do it. Most volunteer fire departments are not a political subdivision of the state. They're not eligible for public aircraft operations.
They're an entity that supports government, but they themselves are not government.
That's the way the law was written. I mean, it's not, the FAA is not, going, aha, we got these guys. We don't, no, it's the Congress writes the laws, and we have to.
Okay, so I've got one here. This is a reciprocity question. What does a Canadian certified pilot have to do in the U.S.? Do we need Part 107?
I can answer that one because I've been working on that one. The answer is you have to fully comply with the U.S. rules. There's no bilateral aviation safety agreement yet between Canada and the United States. There is no technical implementation plan licensing between Canada and the United States. It is on the radar. But if a Canadian pilot wants to fly drones in the United States, you have to obtain a Part 107 certificate. And now, if you want to use a Canadian registered drone, then you also have to get a Department of Transportation, a economic authority, they call it. And that's not an easy or fun thing to do. But the bottom line is, anyone who's not anyone who comes in from the outside, you can, non-US citizens can get a 107 certificate, but you have to go through the initial. There is no, by the way, there's no military equivalency for yet. There's no pilot, private pilot, airline transport pilot, what do they call it, equivalency, or there's, because they're under Part 61, and Part 61 does not, did not, when it was written, did not cover unmanned aircraft. So it's a challenge. It is recognized, and it is on the list of things to do. The list is about 20,000 things to do long.
Okay, I got a lot of questions here, so let's try to be as succinct as we can, or I'm not going to get through them.
Yeah,
What are
John.
What are the requirements
Sorry.
for a tether? It says may sound silly, but can it simply be a heavy duty fishing type line tied to a vehicle? And I think there's the actively tethered means it's got to be taut and tensioned, not just.
It has to have enough tensile strength to prohibit that drone from flying off. And it's important to recognize that the only thing that fits under the public actively tethered rule is an aircraft that weighs 4.4 pounds or less. And then if it weighs any more than that, and if it's going to go above 150 feet, then it's not going to be under this exemption.
And then can you provide the citation for the public aircraft tether requirements again?
It is section 346 of the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. And that all act starts, the way I remember it is I always go down to page 107, which seems to be the start of where the FAA's information starts on unmanned aircraft systems. It's right around page 107. So I was.
Yeah, that's Public Law 115-254.
Okay, so our night waiver expires May 17th. What year? Does that mean all our pilots have to take new training course? I think you said that before.
Yeah, well, that's a great one. That's a great question, right? So if you, and this is what I told this department yesterday, saying, hey, even if you have your recency of knowledge, right, that you don't turn into a pumpkin for another year, after the 17th of May, if you want to fly at night, that pilot has to have had that recent training. So word to the wise, if you have a night waiver and you want to operate at night, and who on this webinar doesn't want to operate at night, you better start cycling your people through before the 17th of May.
Will current 107.39 waivers stay in effect, or will they zero out in May as well? That's from Tony.
They will probably stay in effect because there are 0 category drones approved right now. So, and people may want to relief from certain parts of it. They're still good.
Just to confirm, the new rule goes in effect at a fire scene, would be able to operate above the crews working if they are aware of the operation.
No. So that's another one that's misunderstood. When they say persons participating in the operation, that means the remote pilot, the visual observer, and the person flying the drone if a remote pilot is not flying the drone. It does not mean the SWAT team or the fire team. Sorry. Yep.
Well, they're all our visual observers, though. I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We've heard that story before.
Troublemaker. Well,
So,
that's okay because the remote pilot is going to burn, and so is the visual person.
So what's the training on FAA Safe website that starts on April 21st?
No, the training courses are available now. They were available on the 6th of April, and the new initial test at the knowledge testing centers were also made available on the 6th of April. They are live now.
Would that be similar to a type certificate to obtain a category listing? I'm obtaining a pair of fixed wing systems for training and I'm looking toward future SAR and for long loiter over a scene. It's Michael Trailer.
You would probably be well served to look at order 8130.34 Delta, which is the special airworthiness certificate, experimental category, how to go about getting a drone which leads to type certification. And that would be a drone that you want to use for category 4.
There's also a new, we call it DNR process, stands for durability and reliability. Testing that our air branch is doing right now to do type certification for unmanned aircraft systems. And I think that's what that document leads to. But if you want to take a drone to that, there is work involved. And it's based on, flying over, if you're flying over less populated areas, you have to provide so much safety data. The more populated areas, the more data you have to provide. So,
John Cohen says, under Part 107, is there a certain manufacturer of strobe lights that are sanctioned by the FAA?
No, I don't think so. Remote pilot and command must make that determination.
Steve Fisher asked, where can you buy the broadcast module?
We don't know.
Manufacturers?
There are none out there that have been approved yet, but I know there are people who are itching to hit submit. So I think you're going to see that pretty quick. And
so when we did remote ID testing, we actually go ahead. Sorry, John.
Well, on the broadcast module, one of the advantages of the broadcast module is that you can, if you had multiple drones and you're only going to fly one at a time, you could actually move that broadcast module to the drone that's going to fly. And why do that? Well, some people want to save some money, but the serial number of the module is going to be tied to the owner. That's how we're going to track you down.
And and the economic impact, we determined that these broadcast modules shouldn't cost more than $50. And then when we did the remote ID demonstration to make sure this all worked, we demonstrated 2 different remote ID broadcast modules, and they both worked very seamlessly. They were about the size of a matchbox, or a little bigger than that.
All right, Mark Fisher asks, can we apply for a new daylight waiver after our current one expires on 5/17?
You can. It probably won't get looked at unless you're only asking for something with the lighting. Because otherwise they're going to say, get your 107, take the course. What do you need the waiver for?
So Matt Cicero up there at the University of Maryland test site says, how in the world is training not considered a public function? So we just show up trained magically when we start doing public ops. This is a bad ruling that has immense impact, which we've been talking about.
Preaching to the choir.
Yeah, you are preaching to the choir. I'm a helicopter instructor pilot.
We realize it's not it sort of goes against the safety of what we do, and that's why we've been fighting it.
But again, right, in their defense, right, we don't write the laws.
Are VOs were still required while operating at night if PIC is completed the recurrent training?
No, that is not one of the requirements under Part 107. It is on the public aircraft COAs typically.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Cliff Weaver, do we anticipate the daytime Lance grid altitude limits being same as the nighttime Lance approvals?
Yes, I would anticipate them to be the same, and we anticipate that Lance will have a workaround. They're going to have to modify Lance to accept night airspace authorization requests, but there's a workaround that they're looking at, and fingers crossed, we're hoping to have that ready to go on the 21st of April as well.
Okay. Yeah, and Matt just mentions that the training is not a public function, affects co-operations as well. Yeah, we've had that conversation repeatedly.
Yes.
Is there any hope for fixing that, I guess is the question.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll leave it at that. Currently, I have airspace authorizations for controlled airspace in FAR 93 airspace under Part 107. They will expire in September due to our close proximity to Eglin and MOAs. I don't believe Lance is coming anytime soon. Will the airspace waivers and authorizations continue?
Probably.
Okay. Matt Isenberger says, what about remote ID for tactical drones like SWAT flying indoors, required or not? It is required. They've already kind of covered that.
If the drone has to be registered, it must comply with remote ID. Indoors is not part of the national airspace system.
Yeah, but if you launch it from outside to go inside, then you got to meet the rules.
Right. Yep.
Somebody called me the other day and said, I thought there was like a 100-foot exemption. No.
No, and the way to remember is that if your drone has to be registered, it's going to need remote ID.
Yeah, we always try to find, that exemption.
Yep.
Let's see. Will the FAA enable LEO partners to employ mitigation techniques for drone incursions?
So that's not the FAA's job to do that. It's actually, there's 4 agencies within the federal government that have the authority to do that. It's DOD, DOJ, DHS, and Department of Energy, DOE. And I know that the Attorney General in the last administration was coming up with guidelines, how they would let state and locals deploy counter UAS, but that's not an FAA thing. Our involvement in counter UAS is to make sure when it is deployed, it doesn't impact the safety of the national airspace.
Yep.
Good info. I haven't read anything about daisy chaining 107 PIC. Where can I read about that? Didn't you say that that's not allowed?
It's in the preamble to the final rule, part 107.
Okay, there you go.
It's in, and I think it's in the advisory circular 107-2A. By the way, that new advisory circular is excellent for studying for the new training course and covers
Hint.
over people. Hint. Yeah, it's a huge. It's 107 pages. It's a big advisory circular.
Which I think is something we also sent out by drone responders to all the people who are members. So if you're not a member, join. You get all this free information quick.
It's too expensive to join, Charles.
Yeah, I know I'm gonna have to double the cost. I hate to say it, but 2 times
how else are
nothing
you
is
going to
nothing.
get important visitors like me? Sorry.
Okay, I definitely need to increase the price then, I think. Regarding unmanned aviation rules giving way to manned aviation, is all manned aviation considered to have the same priority to the airspace with regards to first responder operations having to land for a manned hobby flyer wanting to fly over a scene or a media helicopter trying to get a story, preventing use of emergency operations, use of UAS?
Manned aircraft have priority. You must get out of the way of manned aircraft. Now, the news helicopters show up all the time, right? This is not a new issue. It's just a new medium that has increased the amount of, I call it irritation, but drones have to give way. And if it's an ultralight vehicle flying through the sky, you got to get out of his way.
And we have this
options than
question. I've actually had public safety agents say, hey, we had a crime scene or a fire scene and a media helicopter got in our way. What can we do? Can we get a TFR or something? And the answer is most likely no. And you have to yield right away. But if you live someplace where you have media helicopters or media drones, this is the time to start having the conversations with them about how you can deconflict from each other. Because I don't know if you know, a TFR will not deny airspace on First Amendment rights. In other words, we'll always allow the media to come into a TFR if they make the request, because they have First Amendment rights, which are stronger than you working an accident or a crime scene. So it's important to remember that. And the other thing is work with them now so it's not an issue. I know where I live in the area. I live in Maryland, around the Baltimore, Maryland area, and that most of the news media helicopters are actually flown by off-duty police officers. So it makes it really easy. They understand public safety and they don't get in the way.
Yeah, I would say that there still is a test out there. I think that there are some opportunities that if you're doing something that you're using the drone for your operation that's a necessity, you can probably deal with if they're interfering with your incident operations, not necessarily from the airspace regulations, but if they're interfering with your actual operation, that's a state law in a lot of places. So there are ways you can mediate some of it. But as Mike said, meet these people in advance, get to know them, develop a strategy of how you want to work this all out in advance.
Yep. And speaking of TFRs, advisory circular 91-63 Delta, who can ask for a TFR, how you go about asking for a TFR. What?
I will tell you, I'm very impressed with John that he can cite all these statutes. I can't even remember my middle name.
He's got it all on the wall in front of him. He's looking at.
He must, because I'm like, how does he know all these numbers? I have
a Elon Musk. No, it's Elon Musk. I've got a chip.
So we can actually remote control you.
My wife does.
Okay, let's see. You can use the broadcast module from drone to drone, but the drones need to have separate FAA registration, question mark?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm a FAA 107 approved remote pilot. Can I use FAA radio to talk to the tower and manned aircraft?
Negative. No. Couple of reasons for that. One is that the spectrum is already crowded, and it's a FCC. FCC control spectrum. And here's the thing. I called the FCC a couple of years ago and I spoke to them about this. And I used to run an FBO, also a fixed base operation. And essentially, when you're transmitting from the ground with a handheld, you need a ground station license. That's what the FBOs have. When you're flying into an FBO and you make your call, hey, we're 20 minutes out for a quick turn, that's a ground station license that they have, and they have to pay for that. And I've talked to the FCC and they said, if you want to do that, you have to get one of those. And I said, okay. And there's a form. I think it's, believe it or not, it's 605C, I think, something like that. I can't believe I remember this. And said, well, how are they going to get one? And they said, no, we're probably not going to approve it. Well, why not? Well, because that spectrum is pretty crowded and drones have to get out of the way.
And the question is, even if I have an IN number?
Yes.
Okay, I've got a question here. How can we get departmental supervisors to recognize the seriousness of the consequences of failing to adopt the culture of aviation safety? And I will say, one of the biggest ways you do it is you talk about the liability that's going to fall on them.
Yeah. There's no chief of police or fire that is not a risk manager, and that's the real hat they wear these days. And you need to make it very clear that that they're going to be liable if something. The department's going to be liable if something goes wrong. And then there's also a really good case that the National Transportation Safety Board wrote up on New Mexico State Police and their helicopter accident they had several years back that talked about the undue command authority on that operation that created an unsafe operation that caused that helicopter to operate in an environment it shouldn't have operated in, and it obviously crashed and killed people. But they were on the hook for that because of that. They need to know. I always tell people it's important to talk with, there are, we work in this structure, command structure within public safety, but when it comes to that America Systems operation, you're the command of that operation as the remote piloting command by law. And they need to know that ahead of time. And they need to know that sometimes if they don't recognize that you're going to make decisions based on safety, if they try to make you say, well, I paid a lot of money for you, your training and stuff, you need to fly. You need to have that command, courage and say, no, I can't do that.
No,
but it's important to have the conversation ahead of time.
This is a biggie for me. And this is why I know Mike and others make fun of me as like, I'm Dr. No, right? But I'm doing this because this is exactly why I'm doing this everybody's all smiles until somebody hits a bus driven by a nun full of orphans and it crashes into the nuclear power plant and brings down the grid, right? And then everybody goes, ruh-roh, because then we're going to come and who's going to swing? The remote piloting command is going to swing. Well, it's going to be held responsible. The responsible person, this is not understood either. If you have a COA, if there's a person listed on that COA as the responsible person, that's you're signing on to being responsible for everything that happens under that COA and all their training and all of that. So that's not to be taken lightly. And then if it's written to the city's on the hook. And I think a lot of people kind of blow that off, and it scares me for them because I think and I can tell you we've had 2 crashes, 3 or 4 crashes of public aircraft. And remember, your reporting requirements as a public aircraft are much lower thresholds than they are under Part 107. So you got to report pretty much everything that happens
within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours. And then what happens then? Well, that every crash that gets reported has to be investigated by the FSDO that has jurisdiction over where that crash occurred. And I've seen it. So it lands on an inspector's desk and he's going to call you up and say, let me see your stuff and let's talk about this. And, there was a department not far from where I was born, and they had, I think it was something like over 200 potential violations. It was like, you did what? Let me see this. Well, we don't have pilot certificates. I mean, it was, and I'm thinking, man, it's a good thing they didn't hit the bus driven by the non-pathetic victim, right? Because the ambulance chasing lawyers would have had a field day with them.
And I just want to point out that John will talk about this bus driven by the nun forever and at least 100 times. So get used to it, because you're always going to hear it, and he's going to, and when it happens, he is going to nail you if you're the one doing it.
I told you.
So I got three questions left. Is the Civil Air Patrol exempt when on a rescue mission or practice from these new regulations, since they run under U.S. Air Force remote ID, et cetera?
Negative,
nope,
because
a public aircraft operation.
That's right. And I was a cap pilot, and they're flying under Part 91 when you're cap, right? So no.
All right, this comes from Jim Blanchard out there. Jim, good to hear from you. Are fall rate arresting devices allowed in a DOC? Will the FAA be facilitating the DOC of compliance process where a manufacturer and parachute maker work together to get into Cat 2 or Cat 3?
Second question is probably yes. And then the first question is, we don't know. I don't know exactly what the means of compliance. There is in the preamble, I believe. Go to the Part 89 preamble. Sorry, this is the Ops Over People one. Well, there's both. Anyway, we're looking for consensus organizations to weigh in on that, such as RTCA and people like that. And then also under the subpart B in the preamble, they talk a little bit about that. But that's a whole, and that's going to be done by our airworthiness people. And I do believe more guidance is coming on that.
Okay, the last one. Any plans to allow local law enforcement officer partners to assist with FAA regulation enforcement to support LEAP agents?
So the answer right now is no. The answer is no. That's all I can say at this point.
The answer is no. Okay, well, we answered 47 questions. So excellent. Thank you all for the time. And actually were more questions even answered in the chat room by Mike and Skip. So thank them for that. Next time we're going to make sure that, because they couldn't see the Q&As, it was only coming to us as panelists. So we're going to see if we can't get whoever's going to be joining the group as being kind of moderator, so they can see all the questions and answers as we go through.
Yeah, great idea.
Good.
And Steve Pansky also. Thank you, Steve.
Yes, Steve. Great group. And this wraps up this session. Please join Drone Responders just to make sure you keep up with all the different things that are going on. And we will see you next time. However, I wanted to point out that for May and June, we will not be doing these sessions, because in May, we will be doing something at AUVSI, including Mike and Steve Pansky and others. So it's no use in duplicating that effort. And then in June, we have the FAA symposium, and there'll be something similar along those lines that'll be done at that session. So, and in July, we're not doing a session because of vacations. So we'll see you back here.
This is Ice Tea.
On the
Charles,
second,
Here it is.
This is Ice Tea.
The second Wednesday of August is our next live session with this. So thanks, John, Mike, Steve.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Mike.
Thank you for the great questions, and fly safe, everybody.
See everybody
Thanks,
next time. Be
everybody.
safe.